It's May 21st, 2017 in Rosemont, Illinois. The main event for the WWE Championship has just concluded, with Randy Orton losing the belt to a man named Jinder Mahal. As Mahal holds up the championship, this moment and the title reign that follows is remembered as one of the most embarrassing series of events in the history of WWE. But before we can talk about that, we have to go back. Further. Come on, keep going. Even farther back than that. There we go. A foreign heel in wrestling is a common trope where a foreign wrestler is portrayed usually as either a nationalistic villain that looks down on whatever the home country of the promotion is and seeks to prove their nation's superiority, and or an embodiment of negative stereotypes of that country. It's a gimmick that stretches back over a century to wrestlers like Yusuf Ismail, the Terrible Turk, a strongman sent by the Sultan himself who was so dominant that he even beat the legendary Evan Strangler Lewis, a pioneer in American professional wrestling. And the trope only continued on from there with wrestlers like the German tag team Fritz and Waldo von Erich. The Sheik, a wealthy man from the Syrian desert who would stall before matches by praying to Allah and attacked his opponents with concealed weapons like pencils. The Iron Sheik, originally a face who switched over to a gimmick that was directly inspired by the Sheik. A powerful man who would challenge people to Persian club swinging contests and spit at the mere mention of America. Kamala, the Ugandan headhunter who would wear a loincloth, carry a spear, and had a penchant for biting people. Rowdy Roddy Piper, a trash-talking Scotsman with his own wrestling talk show, The Piper's Pit. Yokozuna, a massive sumo wrestler who was assisted by his dastardly manager, Mr. Fuji, who would throw salt in the opponent's eyes. Bret Hart, who during the final period in his career with WWE would be a despised heel in America, while a beloved hero in his home country of Canada. Then there is the plethora of Cold War Russians like Nikolai Volkov, Boris Zhukov, Ivan Koloff, and Nikita Koloff. Russian bad guys were very common during this time, and even years later with people like Vladimir Kozlov and Rusev. Or how about Ludwig Borga, a Finnish man who hated America because they didn't respect the environment? Yeah, that was a thing. Foreign heels have been a part of wrestling almost as long as professional wrestling itself. Even if someone has only a passing awareness of pro wrestling, chances are the foreign heel gimmick is one of the things they think about when conjuring up an image of it in their head. And Jinder Mahal is one of these foreign heels. Jinder Mahal began his career during the 2000s on the indie scene working for promotions like PMW, Stampede Wrestling, GNW, and PWA. The nephew of famous Stampede heel Gama Singh, he would eventually adopt the ring name Tiger Raj Singh and tag with his cousin Gama Singh Jr., winning multiple tag championships as well as winning the PWA Heavyweight Championship from his cousin in 2009. In 2010, he left the Indies to join WWE's developmental promotion FCW, now under the name Jinder Mahal, and a year later made his debut on WWE television. From there, he went on to feud with various wrestlers, the majority of which he lost to. I'd say his greatest accomplishment in this section of his career was going back down to developmental NXT and making it to the finals of the tournament to crown the first NXT champion, ultimately losing to Seth Rollins. Then, in 2012, he, Drew McIntyre, and Heath Slater formed the three-man band, which found some success before eventually becoming a punching bag for the WWE roster, losing frequently until in June of 2014, Jinder Mahal was released by WWE. Then, after another 2-year stint on the Indies, he re-signed and then went on to continue losing. You see, there is a consistent theme of failure when it comes to Jinder's career in WWE, and that comes from the fact that he was an enhancement talent. His role in the WWE was to lose to other wrestlers to give them a chance to show off their moves to the audience and get put over in the end. It was his job to help elevate other wrestlers to a position that he couldn't hold. And that's why it was so bizarre when on April 18th, 2017, Jinder Mahal entered a 6-pack challenge match for a #1 contendership to the WWE Championship. This wasn't the kind of match people were used to seeing Jinder in, but what made it stranger was when, with some assistance from the tag team The Singh Brothers, he won the match and gained an opportunity at the WWE Championship. To put this in perspective, Jinder Mahal, since returning to WWE the previous year, had only won 4 matches on TV, with only 2 of those being singles matches. In one single match, Jinder had gone from the second lowest rung in the company to being in the main event. People were baffled by the sudden decision to give Mahal such a massive push until it was revealed that there was a business reason behind it. You see, India has a lot of people in it, and WWE saw the potential of trying to grow their audience there, so put in place plans to run a live tour there, and also tried to use this sudden elevation of Jinder Mahal to get more Indian eyes on the product. So the WWE audience became aware of why Jinder was getting this sudden push, but most people still believed he wouldn't win the title. This was likely going to be a one-time thing to try to quickly appeal to the Indian audience, and then Mahal would go back down the card. But in the back of everyone's head was a thought. What if he actually wins it? What if Jinder Mahal actually becomes WWE Champion? The very thought of it was absurd. Jinder felt as far away from WWE Champion material as possible, but there always remained that faint possibility that WWE would jump the shark and actually do it. And then they did. As stated in the beginning of the video, Jinder Mahal went on to defeat Randy Orton to win the championship, a moment that was met with near universal mockery. A man who was practically a jobber just a few months prior was now holding a title held by the likes of Bruno Sammartino, Hulk Hogan, Shawn Michaels, Stone Cold Steve Austin, and many other legends of wrestling. But what was worse than Jinder Mahal winning the championship was the reign that followed. So the thing about foreign heels is that they can be problematic. At its core, the idea of the foreign heel is presenting a villainous character from another country who often either doesn't respect the nation they are wrestling in, or is just portraying people of that country in a bad light. Then they go up against a representative of that promotion's country who beats them and reinforces the strength and pride of that nation. In other words, it's nationalism. These people from other countries are bad and we are good, so a good guy who is one of us will beat the bad guy as we all chant our country's name in unison. It reinforces the idea that people who are from our country and proudly celebrate that are morally good, righteous people, while those from other countries who do the same are evil and need to be put in their place. It's the kind of wrestling gimmick that feeds directly off things like xenophobia and racism, even if that isn't the direct intent. Wrestlers are being asked to portray their heritage in a negative light to evoke anger from an audience that considers them alien. And what makes this even more awkward is that many of the famous foreign heels over the years aren't even from countries or cultures that they portray. The Von Erich brothers weren't from Germany. The Sheikh, while of Middle Eastern descent, was not a Muslim, but instead a Maronite Christian. Yokozuna, a Samoan man, while accurately, albeit broadly, billed as being from the Polynesian Islands, was clearly representing Japan by carrying the Japanese flag to the ring during his entrances. For many casual viewers who didn't pay attention, they probably just assumed he was from Japan. I mean, even Hulk Hogan thought he was Japanese.
I'm issuing the challenge to either you or the Jap, brother!
And many of the evil Russians over the years were not actually Russian. Nikolai Volkov, Yugoslavian. Boris Zhukov, American. Ivan Koloff, Canadian. Nikita Koloff, American. And Vladimir Kozlov, despite having the great accomplishment of being the first Ukrainian man to wrestle for the WWE, was billed as being from Moscow because it's a lot easier to sell a big scary Russian than a big scary Ukrainian. So you often see people representing countries and cultures they aren't even connected to as bad guys meant to be despised by the audience, which adds an extra layer of issues with the trope. But even when the people involved are connected, that in its own way is really awkward. Take for instance New Jack. While not a foreign heel in the traditional sense, when he wrestled for Smoky Mountain Wrestling, he was a black man wrestling in front of a mostly white audience, and was pushed to fan the flames of racial tensions to evoke a racist response from the southern crowds. Heat at any costs, even if it means subjecting one of your wrestlers to your own audience's vitriolic racism. Then there is Kamala, who, I mean, do you really need me to explain to you the problem with this? He was a black man being asked to portray a savage jungle man from Uganda. To preserve kayfabe, he had to pretend both in-ring and publicly that he could only speak in yells and grunts. Yet despite the obvious problems with the gimmick, Kamala was able to take the character and own it, becoming one of the biggest stars in wrestling. However, according to Kamala himself, he wasn't paid nearly as much as many of the other high-drawing wrestlers, and after his career in wrestling ended and his diabetes led to him losing both of his legs, he spent the rest of his life in poverty, living off disability, until in August of 2020, he passed away from COVID-19. A tragic story of a man who was given a very controversial gimmick, made it work anyway, but in the end had nothing to show for it. Rest in peace, Kamala, you deserved better. But when it comes to WWE, there were few characters as infamous as Muhammad Hassan and Daivari. Hassan, a man of Arabian descent, and Daivari, of actual Iranian descent, noticed that after 9/11, prejudice towards Middle Eastern people had skyrocketed. They would cut promos about things like how Hassan's Uncle Akbar's business was closing down because people no longer wanted to shop at Arabian-owned businesses. How, despite America supposedly standing for equality, has allowed rampant racism and Islamophobia to grow within the country. And of course, these two men trying to fight back against the prejudice of the time were America-hating heels that Hulk Hogan ended up beating up at WrestleMania. There is something upsetting about having wrestlers address real, genuine issues with hate that affect them in real life, and be presented as villains for it. Like the very act of criticizing America, even when that criticism is absolutely correct, is something worthy of condemnation. America did have humongous problems with the treatment of Islamic and Middle Eastern people in the wake of 9/11, and even 20 years later still does. Accusations of terrorism, even against children, violations of privacy at airports, teachers telling children, "What are your people doing?" In a 2017 poll by Pew Research, around half of all Muslims reported facing discrimination in the past year. All of this is just what I found in a single article, and there are plenty of others out there that go into detail about just how bad Islamophobia is in America, and how 9/11 continues to be a big contributor to this problem. So the point is, why book people as bad guys for trying to address these real issues? Hassan and Daivari would eventually be involved in a massive controversy. After Undertaker defeated Daivari on an episode of SmackDown, Hassan got on his knees and prayed, summoning a group of masked men who proceeded to beat down and choke out The Undertaker in a segment that was likely supposed to evoke terrorist imagery. And if it wasn't enough that they took a character that was originally fighting against prejudice towards Middle Eastern people and then turned him into a pseudo-terrorist, this happened.
Reports of an explosion outside Liverpool Street Station.
The day the episode aired was the same day as the London bombings. The horrible timing of the segment led to a pushback by networks for Hassan and Daivari to be written off TV. Hassan was beaten by The Undertaker and then eventually released, while Daivari was sent back down to developmental before eventually being brought back to the WWE for a few more years until he was released and thankfully never had his ethnicity used to get cheap heat ever again. Oh, will you look at that, a giant pile of money. In 2018, Daivari, alongside his brother, made his first appearance for WWE in years at the Greatest Royal Rumble in Saudi Arabia, where he waved the Iranian flag and told a group of Saudi trainees that real athletes come from Iran, only to get beat up by them. In case you don't know it, Saudi Arabia and Iran don't get along, so this was WWE's way to get the trainees over by using Daivari to get heat. The problem is it worked too well because afterwards Daivari received death threats. It's almost like exploiting the very real hatred between two nations for heat is not good for the people who have to get subjected to that heat, especially when you're getting paid to do it by a corrupt government that murders journalists, constantly abuses human rights, and will eventually prevent your wrestlers from even leaving the country when they get mad at you. But probably the saddest story of all when it comes to foreign heels takes us back to the beginning with Yusuf Ismail. It's been debated among historians over the decades whether or not Yusuf was actually Turkish or just a French dock worker that they got to pretend to be. But regardless, he was presented as a powerful Turkish man with a love for wealth. He would refuse to accept his fight winnings in paper money, instead having it be converted into gold, including a golden belt. He enraged crowds so much that in one instance they began calling for him to be lynched. Yet despite all of the audience's hatred, nothing could stop him as he went undefeated outside of a single disqualification in his tour of the United States. And so the wealthy Turk finished his reign of terror and boarded a ship heading back to Europe with his earnings. Except that's not really how it went. Despite Yusuf being an incredibly dominant wrestler who won a lot of money from his fights, most of that money ended up going to the people who managed him, while he received very little compensation for his work. He didn't exchange his earnings for some gaudy golden belt. Instead, he ended up buying a ticket in the cheapest section of the ship for his ride back. And what makes it worse is that Yusuf never made it. Yusuf's ship, the SS La Bourgogne, ended up sinking in an infamous incident where crew members violently forced themselves onto most of the lifeboats, resulting in half of the crew surviving but less than 15% of the passengers, with one of the casualties being Yusuf Ismail. Once word got back to the States, instead of honoring the man, his managers further exploited him even in death. They made up a story about how he used his brute strength to force away passengers to jump onto one of the lifeboats, but the massive weight of his golden belt caused the lifeboat to capsize and him to sink to his demise. In the end, he was characterized as a brutish man whose opulence led him to his death. And to go even further beyond that, his manager William Brady said that he had a sluggish oriental brain. Yusuf Ismail's story represents the foreign heel gimmick at its origins, but also at its absolute worst. A man exploited, exposed to hate, and not even given the courtesy of an honorable death. If you'd like to learn more about Yusuf, I would definitely recommend Kim Justice's video on him, which served as the source of a lot of my information about him in this video, and goes into far greater detail than I can get to in this one. While most instances of foreign heels have not been quite this extreme, it helps us understand that this is a trope that is heavily rooted in prejudice, and that even years later, that same kind of prejudice continues to fuel these gimmicks. And that's where we return to Jinder Mahal's run with the WWE Championship. Before I begin my criticisms, let me be clear that I hold no ill will towards Jinder. For all I know, he's a nice guy. It wasn't his choice to be given the championship, and I'm sure many in his position would be happy to be given an opportunity like this. However, this doesn't change the fact that Mahal simply wasn't qualified to hold this kind of position in the company. He was a man who for most of his WWE career was used to just putting over other wrestlers in the mid-card, and suddenly in the span of 1 month was being expected to perform at a main event level. This results in him not really feeling like a proper champion, with most people looking at him winning the championship like some kind of joke. While with WWE, Jinder wasn't really relied upon for his promo work, so his promos as champion felt really stiff and boring, lacking the kind of charisma you'd expect of someone in that position. His in-ring work wasn't on that level either, with his matches feeling equally as dull as his promos. There just wasn't anything interesting to his matches, on top of them being incredibly formulaic, with win after win, usually coming as a result of a distraction from the Singh brothers, followed by a single use of Mahal's finisher, the Khalas, to pick up the win. A lot of people expected Jinder's title reign to be rather short due to how obvious it was that he couldn't carry SmackDown as its main champion, and yet it just kept going. He had a long drawn-out feud with Randy Orton over the next 2 pay-per-views, with the highlight of it being the absolutely insane decision to bring back the Punjabi prison match. For those of you who don't know, the Punjabi prison is an infamously terrible gimmick match known for an overly complicated rule set and 2 sets of cages made out of bamboo that makes it really hard to see what's even happening. Its return honestly felt like a point where WWE were out to troll the audience by not only continuing to have Jinder be champ, but also bringing back a stipulation that nobody was asking for. It's like a rotten cherry over top the expired ice cream that was Jinder Mahal's run with the belt. Despite their attempts to legitimize him, Jinder Mahal just wasn't somebody who could be taken seriously as champ, and as a result, during this period, the US championship scene starts to feel like a bigger deal than the main championship. And then from there, Jinder's next feud was with Shinsuke Nakamura. To give you context, Shinsuke was a legend from New Japan Pro Wrestling. At the time, WWE acquiring him was a huge deal, as he was seen as one of the most beloved wrestlers outside WWE. As the king of strong style, he was a wrestler with a focus on stiff strikes that brought a lot of intensity to his matches. After a successful run in NXT, it felt like Nakamura was destined for greatness on the main roster, and then he had a boring feud with Dolph Ziggler that completely destroyed his momentum. So by this point, Nakamura needed something to get that momentum back, and after getting a victory in a #1 contenders match against the man himself, John Cena, it felt like this was it. Nakamura was going to win the belt, become the first Japanese WWE champion, and finally bring an end to Mahal's god-awful reign. That didn't happen. At SummerSlam, once again, a distraction from the Singh brothers, Kalash, 1, 2, 3. The hope that Nakamura was going to be a big deal on the main roster started to go up in smoke, but there was still a chance. The feud kept going with Nakamura getting another shot at the Hell in a Cell pay-per-view. This was it. This had to be it. There is no way they would set up Nakamura to lose a second time to Jinder Mahal. It would be an absolute travesty of booking that would leave Nakamura's main roster run a complete disaster. So of course they had Nakamura lose to Jinder again. Seeing this moment just broke me. It was some of the most anger I've ever had watching anything. And not in the, oh, this is some good heat way, in a finger poke of doom, this is god-awful booking way. They took one of the most exciting new wrestlers in WWE and buried him to put over somebody who never should have gotten the belt in the first place. Sure, Nakamura did eventually go on to win the Royal Rumble, but that just ended in yet another drawn-out feud for Nakamura where he never got to win the championship. Nakamura does have some success in WWE with some mid-card championships and a King of the Ring to his name, but to be honest, I doubt he'll ever climb to the heights that people were expecting he would. This was an opportunity to really capitalize on Nakamura and let him be the main eventer we knew he could be. Instead, they let that opportunity slip through their fingers, and they did it for this garbage run that shortly after this fell apart completely. The point where WWE finally realized that Jinder simply wasn't at the level of a true main eventer was the pay-per-view Survivor Series. Survivor Series being an event where WWE's two biggest shows, Raw and SmackDown, compete to decide which brand is superior, with most of these matches being champion versus champion matches, including world champions of both brands. And at Survivor Series, across the ring from Mahal would be, let me check my notes here, oh yeah, Brock Lesnar. Lesnar was the single most dominant and protected wrestler in WWE at the time. His accolades were massive, from being a former UFC heavyweight champion to being the person who ended Undertaker's legendary undefeated streak at WrestleMania. If anything, you could say that WWE made him too dominant. And if you want to hear me talk more about that, check out my old video about Lesnar. The point is that Lesnar was on a completely different level than Jinder Mahal, so far above him that any thought that Mahal had even the slightest chance of winning was completely and utterly laughable. It was an insane mismatch, and yet it would be one of the biggest matches of the night. So despite how much over the months WWE ignored the ridicule of Jinder's run as champion, this was the point where they had to be honest with themselves and realize that this match just wasn't going to cut it. Brock is expensive, with him making more from just one wrestling match than many wrestlers earn in an entire year. So the idea of wasting all that money on a match like this at one of the 4 biggest shows of the year was just too much. So finally, they did it. Less than 2 weeks before Survivor Series, Jinder Mahal finally dropped the WWE Championship to AJ Styles, a fantastic in-ring worker who was well liked by the fans. The match between him and Lesnar going on to be one of the few genuinely great one-on-one Lesnar matches of this period in Lesnar's career. A very different match than what we probably would have seen if Jinder had retained the title. So it's clear by this point that Jinder Mahal's run as champion was an absolute disaster, marred by bad promos, bad matches, and bad booking decisions. But beyond all that, what was probably the worst thing about Mahal's reign was that it exposed just how tired and counterproductive the foreign heel gimmick is. The entire reason why Jinder Mahal was given the title in the first place was because WWE wanted to appeal to the Indian audience, but instead of presenting Jinder as a hero who represented the Indian people in a positive light, he was yet another one of the America-hating foreign bad guys who have existed for years. Even when the point of Jinder being champion was to appeal to that demographic, WWE couldn't imagine him as anything other than that stereotypical trope. So we ended up with a reign that fundamentally doesn't make sense, as it's trying to evoke a patriotic response from the American audience while simultaneously courting the audience that ends up on the butt end of that patriotism. This results in incredibly awkward moments, like when an Indian woman is brought in to sing the Indian national anthem, only for the crowd to boo her and chant USA. Then, to add to the already really awkward counterproductive nature of Jinder's foreign heel gimmick, during his feud with Shinsuke, he ended up engaging in mockery of Nakamura that came off as racist towards Japanese people. I feel this all comes down to the fact that Vince McMahon is an old dog with no desire to learn new tricks. As a businessman, he realized that there was value in trying to get an Indian audience, but as a booker, he didn't know what to do with Jinder besides book him how he's booked people like him for years, without realizing how these two ideas conflict with each other. As a result, Jinder's run failed to accomplish what it set out to do, not eliciting any kind of large increase in Indian viewership. And by the end, the Indian tour that Jinder was supposed to be the centerpiece of had its dates cut down to just one event where he lost to Triple H. All of that investment in Jinder Mahal as champion bore no fruit. It was an ill-thought-out business decision that resulted in decreased TV ratings, poor ticket sales, and squandered the potential of Shinsuke Nakamura as champion. So after talking so much about how WWE failed to get the Indian market with Jinder Mahal, let's take a look at a time where WWE tried to do something similar and succeeded. Let's talk about Eddie Guerrero. On February 15th, 2004, Eddie Guerrero defeated Brock Lesnar for the WWE Championship, a push that came as a result of WWE wanting to appeal more to Latinos, especially Mexican Americans. But there are a lot of key differences between Eddie and Jinder. First of all, unlike Mahal, Guerrero was considered one of the best in-ring workers in the WWE and oozed charisma that Mahal simply lacked. He was someone who developed a following from an incredible career that saw him work in everything from the Mexican promotion AAA to New Japan to ECW to WCW and finally WWE. Eddie was an excellent wrestler who was absolutely worthy of holding the WWE Championship. The other factor that made Eddie Guerrero's title win work was that, unlike Jinder, his victory and subsequent reign was framed as something positive. Eddie was a man who, prior to this win, had struggled with addiction, but was able to fight off his demons and return to WWE. When he won the title, it was one of the most heartwarming moments in wrestling history, as he jumped into the crowd, hugged his mother, and then stood on top of the announcer's table with the championship in one hand and the Mexican flag in another. This was such a positive moment, regardless of if you were Latino or not. This was a man who worked hard, struggled, and persevered, finally getting his well-deserved moment in the spotlight, a moment that gave off the exact opposite emotions that Jinder's win had, where with Mahal there was mockery, with Guerrero there was an overwhelming sense of joy. That's part of why it was so tragic that less than 2 years after this, Eddie passed away from heart failure. A death that emotionally impacted the people who worked with him as well as the fans who loved his work. But even over a decade and a half after his passing, he remains beloved to this day. It isn't uncommon to see wrestlers pay homage to Eddie or see his name occasionally trend on Twitter out of the blue just from people talking about how amazing he was. Eddie is a legend who, despite his short time on Earth, will have his legacy go on long after his death. The success of Eddie's victory tells us a lot about what went wrong with Jinder's. WWE's insistence on presenting Jinder as a nationalistic heel doomed his ability to make a real connection with the audience that WWE was going after with him. The foreign heel gimmick is something that is so deeply rooted in the identity of wrestling that it has continued to exist long after the point that we should have moved on from it. And this can be noticed even in places that are trying to move wrestling forward in a modern direction. Case in point, AEW. I'm going to be completely honest with you guys. I really like AEW. I've had a falling out with WWE programming for years now, and I feel AEW has delivered a comparatively much better product. Better promos, better matches, and most of all, better booking. But even with how much I enjoy AEW, it isn't perfect, as can be seen with the feud between Cody Rhodes and Anthony Ogogo. Cody is a wrestler with a reputation of often taking old school wrestling ideas and making them new again due to the heavy influence of his father, wrestling legend Dusty Rhodes. However, there was an old wrestling trope that even Cody couldn't salvage, and that was the foreign heel. Ogogo is a former British boxer who beats people up, drapes them in the Union Jack, and loves to insult Americans while speaking of the superiority of his native country. So in response, Cody ended up cutting one of the most awkward promos I've ever seen. Let me set something straight. Cody is excellent on the mic. He can imbue his promos with a ton of emotion. Just listen to his Ellis Island promo early on in AEW and you'll see what I mean. So I think it says a lot that even with someone who is as good a talker as him, even he can't salvage this feud. The promo had him ramble on about how Ogogo can't say bad things about America because he has a visa, and examples of immigrants who ended up being successful in wrestling. He talks about how America used to have segregation, but now he's going to have a child with a black woman. And he tops it all off with the announcement that he'll be using his father's nickname, the American Dream, for his match with Ogogo. Now, I will say Cody is clearly trying really hard with this promo. He is very emotional and passionate. But no matter how much he tries to use his mic skills to cut a good promo here, it is just an absolute mess. Lording someone's immigration status over them as a way of telling them to shut up about America and be grateful for being here is a really horrible thing to do. Listing off successful immigrants to paint this picture of America being a land of opportunity while ignoring the poverty and prejudice that immigrants have had and continue to deal with in America is obfuscating the struggles of those people. And bringing up the history of racism in this country while trying to use your daughter as an example of how far we've come rings pretty hollow when it's very clear that America still has many issues when it comes to the treatment of black people in this country. From higher incarceration rates to police brutality to income inequality, America has a long way to go to address these things. Black and white people getting to marry and have kids is a bare minimum civil right that was achieved more than half a century ago. And while it might mean a lot to Cody personally, bringing this up is like putting a band-aid on a leaking dam. And to make things worse, Cody thought it was a bright idea to bring up race in a promo that was being directed at a black man. You can predict where the feud went from here. The two fight at Double or Nothing, Cody wins, yay America. The entire storyline was a disaster that ended up being the catalyst for Cody's fall from grace, with him going from being a beloved babyface to one of the most controversial figures in AEW, reflecting the same kind of audience rejection as John Cena and Roman Reigns. If this feud taught me anything, it's that no matter the talent involved or how much an attempt there is to subvert ideas in the modern day, the foreign heel gimmick just doesn't work anymore. People are a lot more socially aware than they used to be and less willing to engage with storylines like this, especially not the AEW crowd that largely enjoys AEW because it feels so fresh and modern compared to WWE. Some old school ideas can still work today, but this just isn't one of them, and yet it continues to persevere despite being long past its expiration. I think this comes down to just how much the trope has been tied to the identity of wrestling itself over the years. Many of the legends of the business were either foreign heels or got over by beating them. The Sheik was a pioneer in hardcore wrestling. Fritz von Erich became the patriarch of one of the most famous, albeit tragically faded, wrestling families in history. The Iron Sheik is an iconically eccentric character both in and out of the ring. Roddy Piper is one of the greatest promos in the history of the business. Brett revolutionized the WWE with his technical skills, moving their image away from big beefy men to more in-ring technicians. The list goes on. It's a part of wrestling's legacy that has been hard to let go. But at this point, it just doesn't work anymore. Not with the smarter and more aware audience of today. That's why I want to end things on a story of a man who was once constrained by the gimmick and went on to break free of it and go on the run of his career. That man's name is Miro. Miro, or Rusev as he was called in WWE, immigrated to the United States in 2008 to pursue his dream of becoming a professional wrestler. In 2010, he joined WWE's developmental territory, FCW, and continued wrestling there for a few years, even after its name was changed to NXT. He then made his main roster debut at the 2014 Royal Rumble, and officially joined the main roster in April of that year. But just 1 month after becoming a regular member of the roster, he was suddenly given the same treatment that so many wrestlers like Rusev received. He was turned Russian. Despite being from Bulgaria, he started to develop a loyalty to Russia and declared that he was moving there. He proceeded to dominate wrestler after wrestler until eventually capturing the US Championship. And while I'm sure this is a moment that Rusev was proud of, I can imagine that it was probably bittersweet. Even though he was the first Bulgarian to ever win a title in WWE, he had to continue presenting himself as a Russian. All of this culminated in a WrestleMania match with John Cena, where although Rusev had probably one of the coolest entrances in history, look at it. The dude's riding in on a goddamn tank. It ended up boiling down to yet another story of the big, strong, bad Russian losing to the patriotic, morally good American. And if that wasn't enough, Rusev would then proceed to lose to Cena at the next 2 pay-per-views. Rusev eventually dropped the whole Russian gimmick and went back to being a Bulgarian, but he was still portrayed as the same kind of foreign nationalistic heel, joining a faction of similar bad guys, the League of Nations. Rusev would also once again go on to face Cena, this time in a flag match, where for the 4th time, the American good guy prevailed against the foreign evildoer in the corniest match type possible for this kind of story. At this point, Rusev, despite being a talented wrestler, was clearly being boxed in by the foreign heel gimmick, with it defining much of his career up to this point. But all that changed in September of 2017 with the beginning of Rusev Day. Rusev Day was a gimmick where Rusev, alongside his partner Aiden English, would declare every single day the holiday Rusev Day. And while on the surface this gimmick seems really silly, it was actually a welcome change of pace for the character. After constantly being the big, aggressive Bulgarian heel, Rusev was showing off just how goofy and charismatic he could be with Rusev Day. It became one of the most popular chants in WWE, and once it was slapped on a t-shirt, became one of their best-selling pieces of merchandise. Rusev wasn't just over with the fans, he was one of the most over people in the entire company, all from a silly little idea that managed to connect with the audience far greater than anyone could have predicted. However, there was somebody who didn't take Rusev's rising popularity seriously, and that was Vince McMahon. When Rusev approached Vince about the popularity of the Rusev Day gimmick, Vince responded by telling him that it was just the audience messing with him. Rusev tried to prove the genuine popularity of the gimmick by showing him that the t-shirt had sold out, leading Vince to simply say, well, maybe they didn't make enough. There is a lot to be read from this conversation. It really points out Vince McMahon's mindset towards wrestlers who get organically over with fans instead of through his booking. He refused to acknowledge it, instead insisting that it's just ironic mockery, and even when he was shown just how much money Rusev was making him in merch sales, he had to underplay his success with the ridiculous excuse that they simply didn't print many shirts. What you could also see from this conversation is how Vince refuses to abandon the typecasting he assigned Rusev. I have no way of knowing this for sure. I can't read Vince's mind, but throughout Rusev's time on the main roster, he has constantly been booked over and over as the generic foreign heel. That's clearly what he saw Rusev as, and when he was starting to move beyond that trope, Vince couldn't accept it. To him, Rusev was the foreign bad guy, and that was it. And it makes me feel really sorry for Rusev. He left his home country to pursue his passion of wrestling. He worked hard to make his dream a reality, but because of where he's from, he had a glass ceiling put over him that no matter how hard he tried to break through, without the support of Vince, he just couldn't. So from there, Rusev was in this awkward position where he was immensely over with the fans, but wasn't being pushed accordingly, and was still presented as a heel. Instead of striking while the iron was hot, Rusev didn't get featured in the main event scene until an entire 10 months after the Rusev Day gimmick started, where he still lost in the end. Then, shortly after that, Rusev finally turned face, but Rusev Day was quickly coming to an end. Aiden English turned on him, severing the team that made Rusev Day. Then, after just a few months of being a face, WWE once again turned him heel and had him team with now heel Shinsuke Nakamura, until he finally decided to take a sabbatical from WWE. Then, upon his return, Rusev was then turned face again, only for WWE to, give me a sec, book him in an angle where his real-life wife Lana cheats on him with Bobby Lashley. Rusev would feud with Bobby, losing over and over to him in various single and tag matches until eventually he was released by WWE in April of 2020. I don't think anything sums up Rusev's treatment by WWE better than his final storyline and release. For being able to get over with fans, he got rewarded by being cucked, buried, and then released in the middle of a global pandemic. However, while this was the end of Rusev, this was the beginning of Miro. In September of 2020, Rusev debuted in AEW, now as Miro, a shortened version of his real first name. Now, to be honest, Miro's first few months in AEW were pretty rough. He was partnered together with Kip Sabian in a pairing that just wasn't interesting and poorly utilized Miro, but once he broke off his alliance with Kip, he was able to fully come into his own and become the kind of wrestler he deserved to be. While Miro is a heel in AEW, there is a big difference between heel Rusev and heel Miro. The source of Rusev's heelishness usually came from his overt nationalism and anti-American sentiment. Meanwhile, Miro is a deeply religious man who, after winning the TNT Championship, started viewing himself as God's champion. He feels it's his duty to redeem the members of AEW, earning the title The Redeemer. One by one, he brutalizes wrestlers, often keeping his submission locked in long after the bell is rung, only to embrace his opponent and voice his forgiveness to them. Miro still aesthetically embraces his Bulgarian heritage in some ways, like his entrance video using the country's colors, but he is no longer defined by it. Now he is able to portray a much more complex and multi-layered character that balances Miro's ability to not only be intimidating, but also funny. In his promos, he's able to switch seamlessly from talking about how he will destroy his opponents to how much he enjoys making love to his wife, making it flow together perfectly. The funniest Miro moment for me, though, has to be after his match with Eddie Kingston at All Out. Heading into the pay-per-view, Eddie told Miro in a promo to redeem these nuts, to which Miro responded at All Out by low-blowing him, and afterwards on Twitter stating, "Ask and you shall receive, your nuts have been redeemed." And in the time since my initial script for this video was written, Miro's character has evolved even further after losing the TNT Championship. Now, having been met with failure, he begins to question his faith, asking God why he no longer supports him despite his devotion. This crisis of faith eventually turns into anger as he begins to actually threaten God for abandoning him. He stops wearing a crucifix to the ring and instead begins wearing his wedding ring around his neck, representing how he is now shifting his focus from fighting for God to fighting for himself and the person closest to him. Miro is awesome, and it makes me really happy to see just how much his career has improved in AEW. His story is that of someone who rose above the tropes that others tried to define him by and became a far greater wrestler because of it. I think that Miro teaches us not only the limitations that the foreign heel gimmick places on wrestlers, but also how we can grow beyond it and learn to view wrestlers from other countries as more than just flag bearers. The foreign heel gimmick isn't quite dead yet. In the coming years, you'll continue to see examples of it here and there, but I think that because of our collective growth as a wrestling community in embracing people of different countries and cultures, that it's definitely starting to die off. And I think that's for the best. Hello everyone, just want to thank you for watching the video and making it all the way to the end on this one. This has been my longest project yet, and won't be for very long, but I really appreciate you all watching to the end, and I really look forward to showing you more videos in the future. And if you want to check out some of my other videos, here are a few of them right here.